So I wanted to speak today a little bit about formalism, encryption, and centralization, starting with the concept of centralization of human communities. If you look at ancient California as a region, prior to Europeans, Americans, and their westward expansion toward California, the gold rush, really prior to the 17th century, the east coast of North America, the California region, you look at the language families that inhabited those places. What you find is that you can look at one geographical area and travel 50 miles. Now, 50 miles, if you're a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer, you're on your feet all day, you're in peak physical condition, eating no carbs, no sugars, just, maybe some berries, maybe some, which of course have sugar, but you have a few berries a day, you have some fish, whatever, you're on the paleo diet. These guys, 50 miles to them was a maybe 2 to 3 day trip maximum. You put some beef jerky in your rucksack, you've got some, you have a water skin, you can walk for 2 or 3 days and travel 50 miles pretty easily. Yet neighboring tribes within 50 miles of one another did not have mutually intelligible languages. Now, the concept of mutual intelligibility is a little bit subjective. In fact, it's entirely subjective. It's a question of whether you can understand someone else's language. So a good test of this is something like German to Dutch. If you can speak German, can you understand Dutch? Can you speak Dutch, and can a Dutch person understand a German person? So the question of mutual intelligibility is complicated, and it's not exactly a straightforward answer. But simply the proposition that you would have tribes which would be geographically close to one another, but they didn't have mutual intelligibility, indicates that prehistoric man was highly decentralized, at least in certain regions of the world. Now, of course, we have the Indo-European expansion, in which you had a single language family expanding from somewhere between Ireland and Bangladesh and spreading out to fill out those regions. So certainly that would be an instance of a massive sort of cultural and pan-linguistic expansion. Now, that's not to say that Gaelic is mutually intelligible with Hindi, but that these languages are united by a common history. And so certainly it's not to say that the ancient world centralization was impossible, but it's simply to say that decentralization was much more common and much more frequent than we have today. Today, the world is dominated by a few languages. We have English, French, Spanish, Chinese, Arabic. Right there, I've covered the vast majority of the globe. And even if people don't speak these languages as first languages, they usually speak them as second languages. We could add a few others. We could add in Hindi. We could add in maybe some kind of Swahili or something to cover Africa. But this is a massive shift of linguistic centralization that we simply didn't have in the past. When we look at the indigenous cultures of various continents, we see a lot of decentralization. We see a lot of cultural difference and experimentation and independence and lack of interface, lack of communication. Isolation is a good word to describe the state of many prehistoric tribes. Now, still today, we have the Andaman Islands and we have the interior of the Amazonian rainforest, and we have, maybe some Arctic tribes, although the Arctic is a little bit of a different situation. But we could talk about these isolated tribes, but today, when we talk about isolated tribes, we're talking about an exception to the norm rather than the norm. Whereas in the distant past, prior to European colonialization of the world, the concept of an isolated tribe was not necessarily an exception to the rule. Rather, it was the rule that tribes would be isolated. They would be isolated by a lack of cultural understanding with their neighbors, a lack of linguistic understanding. They would differ in terms of religion. They would differ in terms of customs. They would differ in terms of identity. And as you study the Native Americans, contrary to the popular belief that Native Americans all loved each other and they were in peace and harmony with each other, and it was just a big consensual orgy of the non-aggression principle, which is sometimes what is projected upon them because that's such a deeply American idea. I think there's a sort of retroactive projection into the past that if America was founded upon these deeply liberal, non-aggression, libertarian, Freemasonic, classical liberal principles, that the Native Americans must have even been more deeply rooted in these principles, which is, a misunderstanding and a mythological projection rather than a historical projection, and that is its origin. But what actually happened is that you had tribes like the Algonquin, the Iroquois, you had, there's still tribes today, the Wampanoag, you have all sorts of tribes, the Seminole. We could keep listing all these various tribes who were at war with each other perpetually. They could not come to an understanding. They could not, unlike the Maya and the Aztec and the Inca, they could not form empires. They could not form civilizations. They could not form two-story structures. They could not form stone structures. They could not. They didn't have wheels. They didn't have chariots. They didn't have firearms. They didn't even really have, mass production of military-grade equipment like swords, right? They were still dealing with stone tools, flint arrows. They didn't have metallurgy in many cases. They didn't have alphabet or written language. Certainly they were doing a lot better than the Australian Aboriginals who didn't even have fire. It's not to say that they were the lowest rung of humanity or to go too far with that statement. I think we do always have to keep in mind that when we're describing the technological state of a people in history, we have to understand that there is a hierarchy here. It's not as simple. I think one way, a very Eurocentric perspective is to say, well, Europeans are on top and everyone else is just living in a mud hut. And there's an oversimplification that doesn't recognize very distinct differences. I mean, if Australian Aboriginals and the Algonquin or the Seminole or the Wampanoag or any of these Native American tribes ever came into a population of Australian Aboriginals, I can tell you the Australian Aboriginals would have been wiped out because you would have had a war party of Native Americans riding in on domesticated, and actually I want to hold off on that, the domestication of horses. I'm actually maybe even buying into the mythology here because the domestication of horses, I think, is something that really actually originated with Europeans, that Europeans brought domesticated horses to Native American war bands. So that is something to look up and is to fact check, and part of the reason I think it's important that we be careful here is that we do have to distinguish. There's so much mythology out there, and it comes from the extreme left and it comes from the extreme right, where there's a flattening of history, and history is oversimplified, and then we get to the point where the left is saying that everyone who wasn't European was completely peaceful and loving, and again, it was just this idyllic, utopian, and some of that is coming from Marx, but really it's coming from Rousseau, who influenced Marx and the classical liberals, the concept that the prior to the state, prior to hierarchy, prior to organization, there was just this constant peace, which flies in the face of everything we know about microbiology and building up from there. But that it is something we have to be careful about, and even I'm making mistakes here. So when we look at these Native Americans, the broader point is that they were very decentralized. That's the broader point I'm trying to make without getting stuck in the details. The broader point I'm trying to make is that without technology, without cars, without railroads, without written language, without technology, decentralization is very easy. And decentralization leads to perpetual conflict, and you constantly, between the Algonquin and the Seminole and the Wampanoag and all their neighbors, they are constantly at war with one another. They can never come to an agreement with one another. They're perpetual enemies. This is why it was so difficult. There is no common framework like Christianity. There is this, in the same way that people have tried to resurrect European paganism, there was an attempt, or there has been an attempt to resurrect Native American paganism or Native American spiritual concepts or mythology, to resurrect that and to retroactively say, yeah, there was some kind of common Native American spirituality. Now, there are some legitimate, similarities that we can draw between different spiritualities, but the idea that they all felt that they were like, oh, well, we're all Native Americanists, that didn't exist. In the same way that in Europe you had, well, we're all Christians. Or even in pre-Christian Europe, well, the Romans would go to the Greeks and they would say, well, you worship Zeus and we worship Jupiter, but it's all the same God at the end of the day. There was a perennial ideal, and from our reading of Pythagoras and his later, the people who he influenced, like Plato, we see this perennial idea being explicitly pushed. So there was this latent perennialism in the Mediterranean, and even in the north among the Germans, you had various Germanic tribes who might fight among one another, similar to the Native Americans, but they had a common concept of we all worship Odin, or Wotan, or Wotanaz, or you can look at the ancient spellings and pronunciations there, but they did have a common god, they did have a common Norse pantheon, and you had the Slavic pantheon, you had the Celtic pantheon. The Native Americans were a bit more disparate, in that you can still identify, Father Sky, Mother Earth, that sort of thing, very basic, crude concepts, but having different names for gods. The lack of a written language and their understanding of linguistics, I think, led to a lot more conflict than you would have otherwise seen had they been able to step back and think about symbols and symbology in the way that Pythagoras was doing with number, of saying, okay, well, what's the universal, what's the higher ideal here that is then instantiated in physical forms and symbols, and looking at things from a more perennial perspective or a universalist perspective. You didn't have that. So there is a feedback loop between linguistic coherence and understanding that we have. I mean, language is a kind of technology. This is where you have to give someone like Kurt Doolittle some credit, because he is one of the first people who really took, to my knowledge, who really took this concept of property and technology and was able to convincingly, within a materialist framework, to identify abstract concepts like language or genetics or culture, and to quantify those things as technologies or properties. Now, maybe that happened before, but typically when we discuss the term property, we're coming from a classical liberal lineage which does not recognize the legitimacy of things like religion or culture, and sees those things as immaterial and therefore irrelevant. And Kurt came along and he sort of then reified some of those things. Now he has a very stringent definition of truth, and of what is deception and what is unhealthy and what is counterproductive. And he views the entire discipline of psychology as a fraud and a waste of time. And I'm not sure that's correct. I think that people do have a psyche that requires a lot of immaterial symbology and internal communication, not just communication between different human beings, but within human beings. We have to have communication between our consciousness, our subconsciousness, our unconsciousness. So Freud here is getting at something legitimate, which of course really comes from the Greeks, had an understanding of this, that there has to be inner harmony within the individual. And that's where I think the realm of psychology, and therefore the realm of religion, is providing a real service. Now, if you're a one-dimensional, autistic, straightforward, cold-minded, very disciplined, very Northern European, very, you only see that which is visible, those things which are invisible you call a fraud, then you run into problems. But I think there is a kind of a bridge here that's being laid down, or kind of a middle way that you can sort of see how we can eventually come to an understanding where we start to see that language is a technology and linguistic coherence is an asset. And centralization allows people to come together and act in a participatory manner rather than a competitive manner. Now, I come from a libertarian background, and the concept of competition has always been very important to me as this evolutionary concept that if you don't have constant pressure on human society falls apart. And I've always assumed that this pressure has to be the pressure between different societies. I never really conceived of this pressure as coming on from an internal hierarchy within society, because I saw these abstractions as having no, or I saw like the will of the individual, like the will of the king. His will might be to build a beautiful palace, and he's ignoring and not paying attention to the revolution at the gates, and therefore he creates a weak and corrupt system that is overthrown by an even worse system, right? Because he hasn't paid attention. He is not under constant conflict. So this, to me, is a weakness of centralization. That if you centralize, the more and more you centralize, the bigger and bigger you get, the less threatened you are by your neighbors. The less threatened you are by your neighbors, the less pressure there is to cut down on losses, parasitism, maladaptive behavior. So the less pressure there is from outside, the worse off things come from inside. Now, of course, there's that what the reactionary circle of history, hard times create hard men create good times create weak men create hard times. Now that, when we say men, the inclination is to think of individuals. So an individual grows up with a difficult upbringing, he becomes a strong man, he creates a good family, he gives all sorts of advantages to his children become lazy, incompetent, and as a result, the grandchildren are raised as weaklings. So that is a cycle on an individual level, but I also think it's something we can take more and look at the civilization as an organism following Spengler. We can look at the external conditions to the state, conceiving of the state as an organism. We can look at the external conditions and the extent to which those external conditions threaten the state and are recognized as a threat, and how that impacts the internal conditions. And my hypothesis is that if you have a state which is unchallenged from the exterior, it has no incentive to continually maintain a high level of moral behavior within the state. So this is the concept of Roman degeneration. The Roman Empire defeats all its enemies, it rests on its laurels, and there is no longer an incentive to be moral because there is no exterior threat. Once the exterior threat is extinguished, well, why bother being moral? And that idea takes itself to the limit where finally the immorality of the interior of the state is so flaccid that the Germanic barbarians or whoever come in and they reinstitute morality. Where does their morality come from? It comes from this constant inter-Germanic warfare that's going on. So the constant threat between tribes places an incentive upon the interiority of each tribe to conduct itself along the lines of a moral tradition. These Germanic kings then insert themselves into positions of power through these waves of migration, these invasions, sackings. They insert themselves into positions of power in Italy, in Spain, in Portugal, in North Africa. In all these areas, previously Roman areas, they take over the infrastructure, they take over the tradition of law. They don't destroy the concept of Rome. And the Germans, they integrate so well, and this is a long process, but they take on the mantle of being Roman. They say the Romans themselves, the Roman nation, the Italian people, have forfeited the tradition of Rome because they've become morally degenerate. We Germans, we're taking on the mantle of Rome. We're becoming the second Rome. That was the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. So when people say like Germany is a new country created in the 19th century, that's true in the sense that the Holy Roman Empire was destroyed by Napoleon, and therefore, for a time, there was no political unity among the German people, and Bismarck resurrected that. But there was an institution called the German nation, which was not as centralized as we think of nation states today, but still there was a centralized aspect to it. There was an organization which existed as a political reality of communication between different German dukes and principalities and kingdoms, that at the head you had this emperor who could be appealed to as the judge of last resort, and the emperor was elected. It wasn't a democratic process in the sense that the demos was not electing the emperor. The emperor was elected by the electorate, and the electorate, in the same way we think of the electoral college, it was essentially an electoral college. Now the dukes and the princes were not, again, they were not an electoral college, and this is, I guess, the problem people have with the electoral college today is that these people are not necessarily, they don't have to vote with the popular vote. They can vote against the popular vote if you want. There was no popular vote. It was simply there was an electorate made up of the heads of the aristocracy in each region of Germany. It was an empire which, again, was not as centralized as it could be, and there were plenty of conflicts within Germany that eventually culminate in the split between the Catholics in the south and the Protestants in the north. But there was a degree of centralization. I mean, you saw conflicts within Rome to a similar degree. You saw different prospective emperors fighting and vying for power. The empire was split into regions momentarily, depending on who controlled a certain region, and then one would come out on top. He would become the emperor, rule for a duration, and then eventually you'd have another splitting. It was this constant fracturing and rebuilding, fracturing and rebuilding. And that didn't cease. The Germans didn't solve that problem immediately. With the concept of sovereignty that came out of the wars between Protestants and Catholics, there was much more stability because there was a common agreement to respect one another's territories and to allow a degree of autocracy within those territories. And that was then built upon with things like Italian unification, German unification. So, what is the point of all this? Well, we're talking about technology and centralization. And a lot of people have a skeptical view of technology. They look at the past, they look at the present, they look at the future, and they're very skeptical because most of the people who promote technology as a teleology, they're promoting it with this very optimistic view or a very pessimistic view. It's either technology is going to save us, it's going to be a beautiful world, we're going to have flying cars. We understand that kind of utopianism. It's existed for a long time. Those kinds of, they're essentially romance novels or love letters to the future. So that kind of worship of a future technological state really goes back to the 1950s. The worship of technology, I think the show is called The Jeffersons. They're in their flying cars. So the worship of a future technological state, Star Trek, Star Wars, the beauty of it, the aesthetics of it, the cleanness of it, that technology is going to make everything efficient, and it's going to accentuate human beauty, and it's going to eliminate ugliness, and it's going to be egalitarian and all of these things. That's certainly there. And you see it, Heinlein was a science fiction writer who sort of dealt with, alternatives to that kind of utopian view of the future and looked at technology from a more perennialist angle. And then you had the dystopian writers who would say that technology is going to be terrible. So you have many people along that spectrum, but the thing about technology we have to understand is that it is a centralizing force. When I try to think of contradictions to this statement, I'm thinking about the ways in which the internet was described a few years ago as ghettoizing. That people would find their own little niche opinion, their own little niche idea, their own little niche community. They would then embed themselves into that community, and then they would then purity spiral within that community and further splinter off and further speciate. And there's no check on this. There's no balance to this. When you live in a physical community, you can't do this because you will die. Like in a tribal prehistoric community, if you constantly purity spiral and speciate within your community, you're going to break up the community very quickly, and you're not going to be able to face external threats as well as environmental threats. So the necessity for having a certain level of tolerance, a certain level of cohesion, a certain level of centralized decidability, that if there is a dispute can be decided upon. There's not just this, well, we have a dispute and therefore we have to hate each other. There was a level of tolerance and there was a level of deference that you defer to some central authority. Now, whether that's the tribal elders or the tribal leader or whoever that is, you defer to some sort of authority that decides disputes, resolves disputes, and allows the tribe to move on as a cohesive unit capable of handling the challenges of the environment and also other tribes in the neighborhood. So again, we come back to this concept that a unit, whether it's a tribe or a state or a community, it is kept healthy, it is kept moral, it is kept reasonable, it is kept balanced and harmonious, and it is kept self-sustaining, and it has good morality, it has good rules of inner conduct between individuals and the conduct of the individual with himself and his own psyche. It has good rules, and these rules are developed and maintained because of environmental external pressures. Right? These pressures, once removed, allow for error to creep in, and often error creeps in appealing to the desires of the individual. So the individual desires wealth and status and sex and food and all of these things. Usually these are counterbalanced by environmental pressures. You remove these pressures, and really the only force, since there is no thanatos, there is no death, there is no negative pressure externally, there is only eros, there is only the internal pressure, the will to reproduce, the will to eat, the will to consume. So you remove thanatos from a society, from a community, and you introduce the rule of eros. And this is, I'm trying to think of libido dominante, might be the Latin term. E. Michael Jones he's got a book on that. F. Roger Devlin has a book, Sexual Utopia and Power. So these are pointing toward the idea that you remove death from society, you remove negative external pressures, and the only pressure that we have, the only stimulating incentive that anyone has to do anything is eros. It's the desire to consume and to reproduce, to have, to hoard, to be selfish. There's no incentive to cooperate. There's no incentive for cohesion. There's no incentive to identify with a collective, because there's no thanatos threatening you. So, there is, of course, a social instinct, and people do want to have all of these things I just mentioned. People want cohesion, they want identity, they want a tribal in-group, they want to have friends. So clearly we have a social instinct. And we could even call that erotic in some sense, that we are erotically, just in a basic sense, maybe abusing the original Greek root, but we're attracted to people not for use of sex or reproduction or thinking of their physicality, but we're erotically attracted to other people in that we want to be intimate with them. We want to be connected with them. So that is a basic social instinct that goes back to our fear of thanatos. Ultimately, it is an instinct that comes from our ancestral memory of the thanatos that is bearing down on us if we don't unite as a group to confront environmental pressures. But it still exists erotic in the positive sense that even while there is no constant need to, fend off other tribes or to hunt or to gather or to perform these basic survival functions, there's no incentive there, but still we have the erotic attachment. We fetishize sociality. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. We all do that. So desiring friends is not a bad thing. I'm not trying to clinically break down this psychology in order to criticize it, but I'm breaking it down in order to understand it clearly and to connect it with other important concepts. But in doing so, I have gotten quite off the beaten path. So we were talking about technology and centralization, and basically my point is that technology is going to continue, and when we think about the past, there is this what I would call like an abortive perennialism or an ignorant perennialism, which looks at the past and says the past was always the same and everything was always the same forever, and technology is this aberration and it's just a little mistake. It's like a happy little mistake, and soon Bob Ross, like God is like Bob Ross, and he's just going to paint it away. But that's not the case. When we look at evolutionary history, there actually is a huge jump, and there was some evidence found recently for the existence of Homo sapiens living in Greece up to 200,000 years ago, which sort of blew, if true, because it would blow my current anthropological scheme out of the water, where Homo sapiens really only arrived in Europe 40,000 years ago. If true, if Homo sapiens were really living in Greece 200,000 years ago, that changes a lot about what we know about historical migration of human groups. But clearly, there was a group called Neanderthal. Clearly, they were distinct from Homo sapiens. clearly they did exist and now they don't, and they exist merely as a remnant, as an admixed population. They exist as maybe 5% in some cases of the DNA of modern humans outside of Africa. So we clearly see that there are shifts, and we can say that there are technological differences, there are linguistic differences between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. These are not superficial differences, these are real differences. And that is a shift. Whether it happened 200,000 years ago or 40,000 years ago, I guess is now in dispute. But clearly, these huge changes do happen in the past. And the war, the conflict, the breeding conflict, the conflict of control of genetic dominance between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens is one that has been raging perhaps for 200,000 years now, and really has never been decided decisively. I mean, Neanderthal genes are not exist, they still exist within modern humans outside Africa. So they haven't been extinguished, but clearly there is a progression over time where Neanderthals exist as a non-admixed population 200,000 years ago, and then 40,000 years ago, clearly there is this beginning, this preponderance, this domination, this influence of Homo sapiens admixture, which then comes to preponderate. It comes to be the majority. If we look at these European populations, it comes to be a situation where Homo sapiens are the dominant genetic profile, and that Neanderthals are the substrate in terms of the genetic profile of those populations. This is something that's continuing with the invention of agriculture, which is a technology. And agriculture comes and wipes out Neanderthals even more, because you sort of had a steady state in Europe. You had Neanderthals, and then you had Homo sapiens, and they mixed together and they formed an admixed population. And that was stable for a while. But then agriculture out of the Middle East comes, and that is a less Neanderthal population. There, again, all human populations outside Africa, from the Arabian Peninsula upwards and eastwards and westwards, Neanderthal admixture existed everywhere, right? But it was more highly concentrated in North Eurasia, so North Asia and Northern Europe, because those were places where Neanderthals had a competitive advantage. They were more well suited and adapted to those colder climates than Homo sapiens, who originated in Africa. And if that is the case, then Europe would have been a Neanderthal stronghold compared to the Middle East, which was closer to these Homo sapien migration waves. And when agriculture expanded Middle Eastern populations, they began migrating outward, and they began migrating into Europe, and they began wiping out Neanderthal populations, overriding those populations, mixing, interbreeding with those populations, decreasing the percentage of Neanderthal genes in those European populations. And they did it first in southern Europe around Greece, and they continued to expand northward. And the last populations to be affected, and the populations least affected, were those in Northern Europe. So again, this is a linguistic change, a technological change, if we're describing genes as a technology. In the same way that morality is a technology, it's a set of instructions. You know, if I have a blueprint for a steam engine, I have the technology for a steam engine. I haven't built it yet, but I could build it based off the blueprint. All technology is, it's a series of instructions. That's what genes are, that's what morality is, that's what language is. It's a series of instructions. It's a syntax. So, technology is changing. We think of technology as only changing, like technology was invented, I guess, with agriculture. But technology has been changing and in flux for a very long time. The history of biological evolution is a history of technological change. The history of linguistic construction in animals broadly and humans specifically is a history of technological change. So technology has been changing for a while, and we've seen many instances of both rapid and permanent technological change. So the change between a reptilian-dominated world for land mammals, or land animals, I should say, to a mammal-dominated world for land animals, that was a swift, immediate, very rapid, and permanent technological change in terms of biological genetic evolution. That was a permanent change. So people who say, well, we have technology today and it's come upon us quickly, but tomorrow we might just go back to the Stone Age, or maybe technology will just cease in importance, or we'll stop developing technology. The technology we have now, you have to understand, we haven't fully exploited it. We haven't fully integrated with it. There are potentialities within already existing technology that we haven't yet explored and implemented. I mean, what happens when Wi-Fi covers the entire globe, including Africa? What happens when you add 4 billion Africans to the internet? What we have to understand here is that quantitative change can lead to qualitative change, that you can reach certain thresholds. So, if I have a single person, okay, well, let's say I have a man and a woman as a breeding population. There's a qualitative difference between a single man and a single woman and a breeding population of 200. And the qualitative difference there has to do with incest and recessive genes, and the fact that if you have a small breeding population, you have a bottleneck effect, you have a founder effect, and you're going to have a bunch of deleterious recessive genes that combine to have really bad phenotypes. Whereas if you have a larger breeding population, 200, 2,000, by the time you get to 20,000, you pretty much eliminate the possibility, or you really significantly mitigate the possibility of in-group depression, is essentially what it's called. Now people will then expand this to like continental populations and be like, well, if Europeans mix with Africans, that's going to lead to less inbreeding depression. Well, I mean, Europeans, there are like 800 million Europeans in the world. There are like 200 million Europeans in the continent of Europe. So inbreeding depression is not really a significant factor there. Nice try, though. But it certainly works on a low level, where just by increasing the number of individuals within a breeding population, we're not just changing the quantity of the breeding population, we're also changing the quality of the breeding population. Without saying anything about whether the individuals are better or worse or whatever in any given series of characteristics, we're just saying by increasing the breeding population, we're getting better results. Now, some people might not be happy about the idea of 4 billion Africans joining the internet, but it probably will happen. And there will be a quantitative change in how the global economy works, just based off the fact we have this technology, we just haven't implemented it yet. And it's really a matter of time before we do implement it. Like, we already have this thing called Wi-Fi and iPhones. And if we can distribute that to a growing population of 4 billion, that's going to change the way the global economy works qualitatively. So I'm not even presupposing that we invent new technology. But we do have new technology that is waiting in the wings. It's there. We have the blueprints. We just haven't implemented it yet. And one of these technologies that people talk about a lot is Bitcoin, which is essentially a decentralized currency. There's no bank of Bitcoin. No one can just issue fiat Bitcoin when they feel like printing Bitcoin. So it's decentralized in this way, and the decentralization is based off encryption technology. So encryption technology allows for you to prevent fraud. So you cannot fraud Bitcoins. You can take some, like how are dollar bills made? When you have paper currency, a dollar bill is printed. Now the printer is high tech, and it has little fibers in it and has some plastic in it. Like, it has all these things that make them hard to print. But still, if you could break into one of these Federal Reserve buildings or banks or whoever prints the money. You break into the building, you steal the printer, you put it in your basement, you can start printing money. Can't do that with Bitcoin because of encryption technology. And without going into the technical details, because I'm not an expert on the inner workings, but the effects are pretty obvious that with encryption technology, you have certainty. You have certainty that this is a Bitcoin. This is not a fraudulent Bitcoin. This is a real Bitcoin. And it eliminates the possibility for deception. Now, deception in terms of currency printing and currency manipulation has gone on for a very long time. We go back to medieval Britain, and there was a huge controversy around coin clipping, and certain ethnic groups were predisposed toward coin clipping for whatever reason, and that was a huge controversy. So it's been going on for a very long time, people trying to defraud others by manipulating currency exists to the present day with things like insider trading on a massive scale, pretty much controls our economy. And the question of war by deception, informational warfare, where you're trying to trick people and confuse people and all of these things, it works on humans because humans, the systems that we're living in are way more complicated and abstract than the environments that our psychology was built to deal with. So our psychology is inadequate for dealing with the modern world. Our instincts were developed for a simpler time, not the present day. If we can, through gene editing or artificial intelligence, develop conscious agents, which instinctually, that means they're pre-programmed to interact with this environment, this hyper-technological modern environment, they're going to have a different psychological response to attempts at fraud and deception. So you can manipulate people pretty easily by appealing to their selfishness, their emotions. Like a woman can manipulate a man using her sexuality. Now the man in his brain, he's thinking, oh, I want to reproduce with this woman because she has high reproductive value. So, she's asking me to do something I wouldn't normally do. And it's not really to my benefit to accept her demand, but if I do, maybe she'll sleep with me. That's the instinctual, subconscious, evolutionary psychology explanation of what's going on. It's not far-fetched, it's pretty common sense. People understand this. But it still works. It works time and time again that women are able to seduce men, manipulate men using their sexuality, even though it's like, dude, your sexual drive exists because you want to reproduce, but this woman is never going to reproduce with you. So that's a very easy example of the fact that humans are very easy to manipulate. Humans are very easy to deceive. The human psychology is very easy to abuse because traditionally we're used to living in these tribal societies where if a woman says, hey, I would really love it if you would, give me some resources. Usually when the man gives the woman resources, he gains access to her reproductive resources. In the modern world, that's not the case. That's not possible. That's not true. Women can be on birth control. You can use condoms. Women can just sell their bathwater on the internet, right? So there's so many levels of the abstraction of sexuality has gotten to a point where women can offer the illusion of sexuality without ever having to, carry children to term, as it were. You have so many different levels that interrupt that psychic to material process, like the connection between the psychology of sexuality and the materiality of reproduction. At every single level, it's been stopped. So we now have pornography, which is a visual stimulation of sexuality, but never leads to physical reproduction. We also have sex with condoms or sex with birth control, and then you have women can get pregnant, but they have free and easy access to post-birth abortions. And at every single level of interaction between men and women, there's this underlying psychology of sexuality. But at every single level, there are material, technological implementations that separate and divorce this psychology of sexuality with its intended purpose, which is to impel people to physically reproduce. So this is a basic example of how our psychology, our instincts, are easily able to be manipulated because they're not updated for the present day. The present day, really, we should be, I don't know what the instinct should be. It would be very autistic from our perspective. Like, what should people be excited about? People shouldn't be excited by watching porn. Like, porn should give people no pleasure whatsoever. Watching people have sex should not be an enjoyable experience. From an evolutionary, Darwinian perspective, that's not something that benefits us from an evolutionary perspective. Therefore, if we were redesigning human instinct today, right? Human instinct currently is, our sexuality is very visual, so we look at a sexual scene or an erotic scene like visually, and we're stimulated by that because we anticipate some kind of reproductive benefit down the line. If we were to rewrite human psychology and instinct in the present day, we would have to change how human sexuality works. We would have to change how it works. And one of the ways you could do that would be with encryption technologies like Bitcoin. Again, it sounds very autistic. The way it would work would be you would have like a public key, and when you offer people your public key, they can give you some sex coin, and there is no potentiality for defrauding that. It's like when they give you the sex coin, you got the sex coin, and there's no ability to defraud that because of the public nature of it and the fact that the encryption technologies prevent against deception. When you go up to a woman says, "Hey, would you give me some resources?" and you say, "Fine, give me your sex coin. Give me your sex coin." So then they trade you some sex coin digitally, and then you're like, boom, I ensured reproduction with this woman. Or there are the technologies that we're having are starting to make the process of gaining certainty a little bit easier. And this is true across a number of dimensions. So I talked before about centralization and linguistics. We're going to get to a point where everyone speaks English. We're all going to be able to communicate. That's going to eliminate a lot of uncertainty in the world. There's a lot of uncertainty involved in translation. If everyone speaks English, that's going to eliminate a huge degree of uncertainty. We're all going to have a clear understanding of what's going on globally because everyone will speak the same language. I mean, that's just going to happen. There can be some holdouts, I guess, in China, maybe the Arab world. But honestly, besides maybe China and the Arab world, there are very few. I mean, even China, and China is inviting in English teachers. I mean, they're promoting the use of the English language. So the world seems to be moving in that direction. It's ultimately a technological shift. Centralization is becoming easier, and we're reaching a critical point. We're like headed toward this point with technology where we're seeing that if it's possible to edit genes, if it's possible to create artificial intelligence, we're going to be able to build conscious agents from the ground up and rewrite instincts to make them much more impervious to manipulation, psychological manipulation. Now, I gave you the sexual example, but there's so many political examples where Donald Trump promises, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, then he doesn't, and he gives you a whole laundry list of excuses and manipulations and lies about why he didn't do what he said he was going to do. Technology is going to open up the doors for one-to-one correlations. So you vote for something and you immediately, your vote is secured in the sense that, imagine if you could vote and a 3D printer, like you press the button on your computer, like through a Bitcoin encryption, so it's verifying your identity, it's verifying the veracity of the transaction, like everything is above board, everything's public. You vote, you say you go to buildthewall.com and you press the button and you pay like a Bitcoin or a tenth of a Bitcoin, whatever it is, and a 3D printer, like an autonomous computer programmed forklift, drives to the United States-Mexican border, and there's like a 3D printer on it, and like it starts constructing like a one pylon of wall, and then like 50 million Americans do that, and then all of a sudden we have 50 million pylons along the United States-Mexican border. I mean, things like that are going to be possible. Now, that is a very democratic way of looking at it. That's the other problem. As people become more technological, we become more centralized, and authority becomes more and more divested from the masses. So there really is a democratic element to prehistoric man, where technically if you have a tribe of 200 and 199 people disagree with the tribal leader, and the tribal leader says, we're going to do things this way, well, the 199 can beat the tribal leader to death. So the individual in a prehistoric, pre-technological environment, the individual has no power and the collective has all the power. So the democratic nature of prehistoric societies is certainly there to an extent. There's a physicality to the demos. The demos can get angry and it can start forcing things on the aristocracy. So there has to be this constant interplay, which mostly represents itself through the development of language, through the development, and generative anthropology has a huge amount to say about, the ostensive, the imperative, the declarative forms of language which originate in hierarchies as a form of decidability to really thwart the democratic Chthonian impulse to riot, to have conflict, to be selfishly individualistic, right? So clearly prehistoric man was not purely democratic. But we can say that there was more of a democratic element because the physicality of the masses mattered more. We're now at a point where a democratic election is a contest of who was able to better brainwash the masses better. And that is a contest going on between billionaires. It's not going on between the average person and the average person. It's not going on between the white working class and the black working class. It's not going on between, illegal immigrants and, white office workers. Like, the middle class, the lower classes, the broad masses of the people who are assumed to be part of the demos have no power. They simply vote for whoever they're brainwashed to vote for. And the politicians themselves are beholden to lobbyists and to higher factions. I mean, Jeffrey Epstein is a good example of this, where he was obviously blackmailing people, to engage in illegal sex acts and to record them, and to have compromising information on them. It's kind of interesting that he's been brought up again simply to attack Trump. Like, the only reason it seems that his case is being brought up again is simply to use his name and his association with Donald Trump as a bludgeon against Donald Trump. It's going to be interesting if there is a kind of collateral damage in the Epstein case. There certainly is some collateral damage in the fact that, if you look at the Me Too movement, and you look at sexual abuse in politics, sexual predators in politics, sexual perverts in politics, sexual deviants in politics, the real public story that I remember was Anthony Weiner. And he was considered to be the most perverted, deviant, reprobate man in politics, that he could not stop cheating on his wife with 15-year-old girls and things of this nature. So it was clear he just had no restraint, he had no remorse, he had no self-control in these sexual matters, and he was looking eventually to become president or something. And then you had Harvey Weinstein, who was supposed to be one of the most powerful men in Hollywood, and he was brought forth as the most perverted, the most disgusting, the worst case scenario, blah, 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 masturbating in the ficus. So first you had Anthony Weiner, and then you had Anthony Weiner as the most perverted politician of all time, and then you had Harvey Weinstein as the most perverted Hollywood czar, director, producer, whatever his position was. And now you have Jeffrey Epstein. I don't even know what you call him. The most perverted high-class pimp is essentially what he was. He was a pimp for billionaires. And putting those three people in a row like that over the last 4 years or whatever it's been, I don't know if the American how people are going to continue to react to a Wiener, Weinstein, and Epstein just in succession like that. I don't know if the implications and reactions have, if that's a safe. I mean, maybe the American people are really stupid and they just won't notice. They'll be like, wow, these people of German descent with these German last names are really, they're really perverted. There's really something wacky going on with all these Germans who control politics, and they control Hollywood, and they control the international sex trade, and these like German descended people with German last names are just really weird. You know, Louis C.K. is another example of someone who would masturbate in front of women. It's just gross. It wasn't even, it was like there was someone who came out against Trump, and they were like, I was raped by Trump, and it wasn't sexy rape. And that was kind of controversial, the way she said it. And there is like a concept that you talk to a lot of people about these sex abuse cases, and they're like, hey, powerful men have always just taken women. They've always, Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky just couldn't resist, and Donald Trump, he just had to grab him by the what. And this is a popular concept that powerful men can just do what they want with women. But we have to distinguish between powerful men taking like their secretaries on the desk and like having an affair, and like the secretary's into it because he's so powerful, and like we have to distinguish between that scenario and a scenario in which you have a semi-powerful man with a German-sounding last name, and he's like masturbating into a ficus, or he's just like standing in front of the woman and jacking off. Like psychically, like there's a difference in terms of the masculinity, the assertiveness, the aggressiveness. Like there's a difference between wanting to reproduce with a woman, between wanting to have sex with a woman, between wanting to be the dominant partner. There's a difference between that and almost the self-humiliating act. Like the self-humiliation of like, look how gross I am, look how perverted I am, and I'm going to like masturbate in front of you, and I'm going to freak you out, and I'm going to make you feel bad and dirty and disgusting. Like, that's a little bit different. I don't think that's a distinction that's been clearly made. Clearly, feminists are interested in blurring the lines because they want to imagine that like a college frat boy who gets wasted and has sex with a drunken sorority girl, that he's on the same level as a Louis C.K., as an Anthony Weiner, as a Weinstein, as an Epstein. The feminist wants to create an equivocation. That's kind of what feminism as an ideology strives to do, is to confuse sexuality and to create false equivocations. And that unfortunately has even in people who consider themselves, like, there's the feminist dialectic, which is like, Anthony Weiner is like a college frat boy who just raped sorority girls. And then you have the conservative response, or the alt-light, or whatever you call it, people who watch Joe Rogan, this sort of audience of people who say like, I like Anthony Weiner. He's just a powerful man exercising his sexuality. I like Louis C.K. He's a funny guy. Tells it like it is. Like the feminist creates a false equivocation between these billionaire sexual predators and like, college frat boys. And then the conservative response, or like the Milo Yiannopoulos response, is to be like, oh, I think it's just fine. I think it's great. I think it's awesome. So they almost accept the framing of the feminist and then reactively respond, if feminists are against Harvey Weinstein, I guess I like him. If they hate Louis C.K., I guess he's my friend, he's my pal, he's my buddy. So this false equivocation by feminists is then turned around on the other side of the political aisle and embraced, but to the opposite degree. Never really solves the underlying problem. Creates a whole mess of confusion. And I'm not even sure how I got from technology and centralization into this topic. But basically, fraud, manipulation, parasitism. I'm not saying that conflict is going to cease, or that, like, if you have highly complicated technological civilizations, surely they're going to invent ways of hacking and informational warfare and deception and hacking the power grid and spreading computer viruses and things like this. Like, clearly that's going to continue to exist. But within societies, you're going to see more and more centralization, because disseminating ideas is going to be easier and easier as, English as a lingua franca spreads, but also the fact that we're more tuned in, we're more embedded with technology, so there's more instant feedback. Memes are more popular, and so there's this hive mind that develops where everyone is on the same page all the time, which is just not something you had before. Everyone was not on the same page. People are getting on the same page. People are getting on the same wavelength. People are working within the same dialectic. Like, feminists and frat boys are almost, they're accepting the same dialectic. They're like, you either love Harvey Weinstein or you hate him, and if you hate him, you're a feminist, and if you love him, you're a conservative. And this is the kind of dialectic that's being set up, and everyone's kind of like, they're following the same narratives, they're accepting the same facts, but they're identifying on different sides. But it's a very centralized form of politics, rather than advocating for some kind of decentralized tribalism necessarily. Even people of color fall into this trap where you get Mexicans and blacks and Jews and Puerto Ricans, and like Hispanics is that even a cohesive group? No, Hispanics hate each other. Like, the browner Hispanics hate the whiter Hispanics for having white privilege, and the whiter Hispanics are antagonistic toward the browner Hispanics. And there's Puerto Ricans and Mexicans, and they have their own competitions and gang wars between one another. So Hispanic is not a cohesive group, but through the process of democratic manipulation and centralization, we've been able to fool people of color into believing that they're all one block. They're all the people of color block. They're all the diversity block, that somehow a gay man, a gay white man, and a Puerto Rican and a Mexican Catholic and a Jew and an African American Muslim, and all of these people, they just, for some reason, because of the word diversity and intersectionality, these abstractions, which are a result of the centralization of language, that they've been able to be effectively disseminated. They've been able to decentralize been able to centralize all these disparate groups into a single political bloc very, very effectively, which would seem to be impossible from like a prehistoric tribal view. It's like how could these groups form a coalition? Coalitions and confederacies can only be formed through centralization and technology that enables centralization. So as technology becomes more embedded, even if we don't develop new technology, which I believe we will, but as it becomes more embedded, the potentiality for centralization is going to increase. And the level of competition that's going to go on is going to decrease. And so really, at the end of the day, when we go back to our model of competition as the spirit of Thanatos, that is an external negative incentive to produce moral behavior within a system, that's just going to cease to exist. Like, we're going to enter a period where, like, there's very little competition between China and the United States in a military sense. Like, direct military conflict is becoming less and less frequent because of the interconnected markets. Like, I do think that's a legitimate point by the libertarians. If you have two markets that are interdependent on one another, you're not going to be able to have war between China and America because it's mutually assured destruction. So if that's the case, then who or what force is going to provide the cohesion, the moral stability, or the incentive for people to act good and right and healthy and harmonious? What is going to set society on the right track if it's not going to be external conflict between different groups of people, and it's not going to come internally from the demos? It has to come from an aristocracy. It has to come from a top-down. There has to be some kind of sovereign that directs society toward good ends rather than just pure competition. Because pure competition, the interest, if we have a market where all these actors are just competing against each other, it's a zero-sum game, everyone's trying to destroy one another, then you get opiate addictions, you get mass immigration, you get all this democratic warfare. there's all these negative outcomes if there is no centralized authority and everything's just a free-for-all. Then the people who suffer are the average person, the middle class person, the working class person. These people are hollowed out. They're viewed as stones in a stone throwing competition, and people's bodies are just thrown around and battered and beaten, and they're used as tools and scapegoats. And it's almost like, in order to get these people out to vote, we need to get them excited to vote. Okay, how do we get them excited to vote? Well, let's mess up their lives and make them depressed and angry, and then we can get more people voting in this election, and then we can win this election. So there's an incentive in the different factions, political factions, to make people's lives miserable in order to motivate them to vote. Ideally, people should be disinterested in politics because everything's just working fairly well, and it's a fair system, and it makes sense, and it's stable, and it's cohesive, and it just is what it is. And so there's no reason to be interested in politics, because life doesn't suck. Life is just okay. Like, life is fine. Everything's going fine. And so there's no reason to be interested in politics. There's an interest to pay attention to your individual life. But we have this world in which politics is a weapon of various. You have high-level factions, elite factions, using the masses as pitting them against one another. And this is something you hear out of hippies, and this is something you hear about from moderates, and people are like, don't you see, the elites, they just want black people and white people to fight with one another, so black people and white people should actually unite together to fight the elites. Now, that's kind of utopian in a sense, because it requires mutual agreement there between white people as a collective and black people as a collective to put aside their disputes and to embrace one another, which is pretty far-fetched. But there is a point there. There is a point that conflict between groups is exacerbated when you have a market democracy in which elite actors benefit from conflict between groups within society. So diversity is a strength, which, whoa, that might be the video title. Diversity really is a strength, because diversity is a strength for an elite which does not want to be noticed. Diversity is a strength for an elite which wants constant conflict between the masses. Diversity is a strength for an elite which has no intention of making the world a better place or producing something beautiful, but simply wants power. Diversity is a strength, but it's a strength for a certain kind of elite, not for society in general. So in order to remove these market democratic incentives, we need an alternate form of governance. And the alternate form of governance is going to be one in which power is formalized, in which rather than the president being a puppet, the president actually has power. Now, we're using this term president merely because that's familiar to people. I don't care what language we use. I don't care if we call the president a king. I don't care if we call him a prime minister. I don't care if we call him a dictator. I don't care what we call him. But we need to be able to identify who's actually in power. Once we can identify who's actually in power, we can hold that person accountable. We can appeal to that person. We can make arguments with that person. And then really, once power is invested in a single individual, we can get some cohesion to society. And what I would argue is that it would be better to live in a cohesively, it would be better to live in a society with memes and morals that were inaccurate or that were not very good or not perfect, than to live in a society where it's just a moral free-for-all, right? So, or a better example would be language. So it would be better to live in a society where everyone speaks the same language. Maybe they're not articulate, maybe they're not sophisticated, maybe the language involved isn't a very good language, it's a poor language, it doesn't have the best vocabulary, it doesn't have the best grammar or syntax. But it's and everyone speaks the language. It's better to live in a society which everyone speaks the same language, even if it's a flawed language, than to live in a society where every single person speaks a different language. We can't understand each other. So in order to have common cohesion, to have common understanding, to have a society in which there is an incentive toward unity rather than diversity, in order to have that, then we need to eliminate competition between elites within society. And really the only way to do that is to give one faction or one group or one person all sovereign authority, to give them sort of absolute authority, which they can then delegate to appointees. There's, I guess, a case here with Alex Acosta being fired by Trump. The reason he's being fired is because of the PR, because of the story, because of the narrative, the media narrative. And what Trump is saying, and I guess the narrative doesn't really matter either way, but I'm just using it as an illustration. He's like, Alex Acosta is a great secretary, and maybe he made a mistake. Maybe he let this Epstein guy off. Maybe he shouldn't have done that. Maybe he made a bad decision in the past regarding Epstein. But insofar as the Department of Labor, he's doing a great job. So the fact that he's being fired is a crime against the American people. It's a crime against the American people because we're appealing to this abstract notion of justice, of like, oh, Alex Acosta is a terrible guy because he let Jeffrey Epstein go off, and we know Jeffrey Epstein is a terrible guy, and so therefore he committed this crime. He has to be punished for this crime. But in effect, the people who are being punished are the American people, because Alex Acosta, he's going to go off and be a lobbyist now. He's going to go off and work the D.C. circuit now. He's not going to stop making money. He's not going to be poor. His life isn't ruined. He's going to go off and make a bunch of money. So he's not harmed by being fired, by technically resigning. The people who are being harmed theoretically, now we don't have to buy Trump's story, but just assume it's a true story for a moment. What's happening here is a man who is servicing the American people, who's making the economy work well for working class, middle class people, he's being fired for political purposes. And that is something that can only exist when you have a media that is appealing to a democratic system. You remove the democratic system, there is no need anymore to attack when you think about power being delegated to, let's just call them delegates for the moment. Power is delegated from a sovereign to delegates. These delegates are then not under the scrutiny of a media for political purposes, because there's no democratic system that's interested in creating political diversity, that's interested in creating disunity, that's interested in causing factions among the demos to fight amongst one another for political gains and political purposes. That incentive is completely removed. And then it's just a question of, okay, how can you best organize society for your purposes? The biggest problem, I think, is if you did have a sovereign, what would their purposes be? What would they want the United States to look like? So that is an important question. That is something that everyone would be interested in. Well, what does this person want? Are they a Hillary Clinton? Do they want globalism? Are they Donald Trump? Do they want nationalism? Well, really, that's a false dichotomy, right? Because we see that Donald Trump is increasing mass immigration. Effectively, de facto, that's what he's doing. We see that he is, doing all of these kinds of things. He's saying that I'm the real protector of the gay community. So, what is the distinction between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump in matters of actual policy, in matters of what's actually going on the ground in America affecting the average voter? What is the distinction? There's not really a clear distinction there. So at the end of the day, it almost doesn't matter, right? It almost doesn't matter. If we made Hillary Clinton queen, then she might be a terrible president, but we can at least say that the incentives for her to be a terrible president would not be the same if it was not a democratic system. Hillary Clinton clearly was interested in mass immigration because it would increase the Democratic voter base. But if Hillary Clinton is a queen or a dictator or an autocrat, how does mass immigration benefit her? It weakens the United States and increases a Democratic voter base, but if you don't have a democracy, the voter base doesn't matter. So it weakens the United States, it causes diversity, it causes conflict. that just means that Hillary Clinton is going to have a worse off country to govern. She's going to have less resources to extract from the populace through taxation. She's going to have a worse off military. She's going to have all kinds of problems on her hand that are created by mass immigration. She doesn't want to have to deal with that if she's the queen. So she would have no incentive to weaken, to attack the middle classes and to attack the working class through mass immigration if there wasn't this game of democracy going on. So I've been investigating this concept of formalism. The problem that I have with it at present is that I think people are too dumb to be sold on formalism. I think democracy is a great way to manipulate people and fool people. I think if you want to control a society, you do it through democracy, because that eliminates the possibility of your rule being challenged. It eliminates the possibility of you being found out as the real sovereign. So democracy is great. If I was a billionaire, I would support democracy to the hill. I would say this is the best system that's ever been invented. It's the system that's been invented by people like me for people like me. That's how I would view democracy. But there are technological changes coming that increase the potentiality for centralization and really for verifying facts and eliminating the possibility for psychological manipulation through the creation of conscious agents who have a different programming. Our instincts as they stand bias us toward false promises of sex. You know, we look at food and we think, oh, this food's so delicious, and we become obese. We look at democracy, we say, oh, this is egalitarian, and then we end up with mass immigration. So we look at something, it appears to be one way, but it's actually the other way. That's a problem of the fact that human psychology was built for a simpler time. It's not built to deal with the complex realities of our time. Technology is going to, through inventing or changing conscious agents who exist in societies, whether those are human or transhuman societies, I don't know. But it's going to increase the capability for basically the implementation of encryption technologies, which make deception and manipulation less and less possible within a centralized organism known as a state or a network or a neural network, however you want to, whatever terminology you want to use, it's all related, right? A group. And that is going to smash the necessity of democracy. Right now, democracy is necessary because the elites want to hide themselves. But if you have a society full of clones, hyper-intelligent clones, who are not manipulated by democracy, they're not manipulated by false promises, they just don't respond to these psychological manipulations because they've evolved past that through artificial selection, through gene editing, through artificial intelligence, through technological augmentation, whatever reason. It's going to make democracy obsolete. So we're looking at a future in which technology and the effects of centralization are going to eliminate the possibilities of manipulation and deception via democracy. And that is a future which allows and really demands formalism. We're not there yet. We're not quite there yet. I don't think we're in that position yet. But that certainly is a future, and it certainly is a positive statement, at least. I mean, whether aesthetically you like that answer or you think it's disgusting or whatever, at least I'm putting forth something of like, this is how the world is going to be. And it's not just going to end in a clown world, in a piss earth, and other dystopian futures people imagine, in which we're going to revert into cannibalism, and it's going to be like you see those old triptychs, the old medieval paintings where you have Christ in the center, heaven on his right, hell on his left, and you see what hell looks like, and it's just these monsters gnawing on human remains, and like half alive people are being eaten alive, whatever. People sometimes imagine that's what the future is going to be like. That's not really quite accurate. Other people imagine that the future is going to be a perfect place where there will be no aggression. We're all going to have pan-romantic, pansexual, polyamorous relationships. That's also not going to happen. I mean, it can happen in a in a sexual economy in which sexuality is very different from how it is today. I mean, certainly they're like plants, for instance, they just spray their pollen into the air and that's their sperm, right? So there are sexual strategies out there. Different species have different sexual strategies. So maybe that's even possible. But I'm just saying the future is not a non-violent future. Like, violence will still exist, aggression will still exist, competition between groups will still exist. We're not going to have world peace. Not everything's going to be harmonious. It's not going to be an egalitarian Marxist universe in which everyone has the same exact amount of resources. It's not going to be an antenatal universe in which we all just kill ourselves and revert to nihilism and end, the will to power, as Nietzsche put it, or the will to life, as Schopenhauer put it. None of those utopian, perfect, static Apollonian ideals are coming to fruition. But there is something beyond democracy. There is another era that is coming, and I think it's going to be enabled by technology. I could be wrong. It might even happen sooner than I think, but I think that is an eventuality that we're looking at, and it is something that we can meditate on and decide whether we want to recoil in disgust or whether we want to adapt and accept it. There certainly is an archaeo-futuristic aspect to it of we're reverting to a time of dictatorship, in a sense. But that's how technological systems work, because they have encryption, they have centralization, they have instincts that are designed with the total organism in mind. We were designed to deal with tribal organization, not with civilizational organization. So when we upgrade our hardware, we upgrade our software, social dynamics are going to change and democracy is not going to survive. That's it. Thanks for listening. I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.